So now, without further ado, it is my pleasure to introduce today's first speaker, Jason Bowler, Senior Vice President in Ipsos's healthcare team. Jason, you have the floor.
Thanks, Ellen. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Now, before we get started, I just want to quickly introduce our team. So, again, I'm Jason Bowler. I lead our U.S. Market Access Advisory practice, and with me we have Jim McDermott. He's a commercial lead, a leader in our commercial strategy practice, and Fadan Solomon, an engagement manager in our market access advisory practice. So today's topic, really we're looking at the payer management of physician-administered therapies and what that means to your access strategy. Jim will kick us off to provide some background, context setting. Fadan will then provide an overview of some research that we recently conducted, play back some of the findings, and then I'll come back and talk about some of the tools that payers are using to manage these therapies and what it means to your access strategy. And then lastly, we will open up for some Q&A. All right, so with that, I'll turn over to you, Jim.
Great. Thank you, Jason. So why are we here? I think it's fair to say that we've all seen the headlines, we've all read the articles, some of us probably deal with this every day. And what I mean by this is the increasing amount of effort that is being spent on addressing the cost and growing spend of physician-administered therapies. What is clear is that there are many public-private groups taking a deep look at this challenge, and that there are a large variety of tools and approaches being explored and tested with this trend. While we don't have all the answers, for the next 30 minutes, we are going to explore the issue, the solutions that are already in play, and provide our perspective on the implications for organizations like yours. To provide some context, and for example, let's look at the spend on Medicare Part B and D. We all know Part B is the medical benefit and Part D is the pharmacy benefit, I hope. Overall, in 2019, Medicare Part B spend was 20% of Part D spend. However, Part B is under increased scrutiny due to both its higher current and expected future growth rates and its spend per beneficiary. What isn't quite as obvious is that Part B spend has increased approximately 63% since 2015, an annual rate of 13.2%, and it shows no signs of slowing down, while Part D has only grown at 82.2%. What is also interesting is that Part D average spend per beneficiary was $53, whereas Part B was $982, with a big contributing factor being the drug spend on a small number of physician-administered therapies. All key factors and inputs in the drive to address these medically managed drugs for both Medicare and commercial plans. So continuing on our example, I'm looking a little deeper into the top Part B drugs. It shouldn't be a surprise which TAs and which drugs top the list. They are some of our most effective and most expensive medications, and they all require physician administration. And while we are showing the Medicare Part B list, it corresponds closely to the commercially medically managed drugs. It also isn't surprising that many of them are biologics, and most are without generic alternatives. The interesting part is that there is little active management yet of these very expensive medications, but as we will explore over the next few sections, this is most likely going to change. So let's dive in and explore why historically managing physician-administered therapies has been challenging for payers, and importantly, why their ability to do so now is increasing. Let's begin with the challenges. We know that the NDC availability on medical claims due to J-codes often lags, that medical claims are often delayed, that there's limited visibility into the use of patient assistant programs, that there is limited ability to apply pharmacy management techniques such as formularies, exclusions, and steps, and that there is less pressure to manage spend due to the lower total and per beneficiary costs. But this is also changing. Despite these challenges, and given the need I just mentioned about the growing pressures to manage, we are seeing a wide variety of approaches intended to help manage spend, including PBM investments in medical management capabilities, differential reimbursement, such as biosimilars, growth of colorbagging, site of care optimization, evidence-based protocols to support off-label use of lower-cost therapies, oncology pathway adoption, medical rebates, enablement of Part B step therapies, and various proposals such as most favored nations shift to Part B to Part D, etc. To help shed some new light on these challenges, implications, and potential solutions, we interviewed 10 U.S. payers from a range of organizations with a variety of responsibilities. The overall goal of the research was to gain an understanding of how payers believe the management of physician-administered therapies will evolve over the next 3 to 5 years. And the key topics we explored and that we are now going to discuss were the importance of managing physician-administered therapies and priority TAs. Then we will discuss physician-administered therapy access decision-making. And finally, we will look at spend and utilization management levers across priority therapeutic areas. To lead this next part of the discussion, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sanan Solomon.
Thanks, Jim. So the first topic we'll explore is the importance of managing physician-administered therapies and priority therapeutic areas. So we did ask payers to comment on how high of a priority it is for their organization to manage the spend and utilization of medical therapies. And while it's definitely a high priority, there are several more nuanced concerns around that topic. The first of which is that there are a significant amount of specialty drugs in the pipeline today, which means that their potential spend on those drugs is only going to increase from here on out. The second is that with some of these novel gene therapies that have come out within the past 3 to 5 years, payers aren't actually sure that they're going to work and provide value relative to their steep costs. There's also the issue of employer groups who want to have their own customized formularies, and in some cases, they even want a closed formulary. Another big question is how payers are going to shift expensive infusion appointments to sites of care that don't charge as much as a hospital would. And then last but not least, there's the concern of how do we get doctors to administer drugs in the most cost-effective way for us without cutting into their own revenue. And then in oncology, how do we provide financial incentives to providers for adhering to pathways? So we'll explore some of the concepts around those points as we go through the presentation. So for payers, high priority therapy areas basically equals high spend areas. So we've got the usual suspects here, which are going to be your oncology drugs, your rare disease drugs, immunology, of course, ophthalmology, and then there's a mix of therapy areas where most products are self-administered, like asthma and diabetes, but then also drugs like ESAs and colony stimulating factors that would normally be given alongside of chemotherapy or antiretrovirals. Payers have historically had a limited ability to manage these areas, so our focus today will be on how that is evolving. The coverage and reimbursement decision-making process around this specific group of drugs used to be simpler and more siloed, but is becoming increasingly complex. So after 10 hours of discussions with payers and PBMs, what we heard is that it really comes down to 3 different parts of the decision-making process that are changing. So the first part is around benefit placement and trying to understand what is it that makes a drug covered under medical benefit versus pharmacy or even both. The second is the level of integration between decision makers for medical benefit drugs and pharmacy benefit drugs. And the third, which was only applicable to about 6 out of the 10 plans that we spoke to, was the role of the PBM in all of this. So I'll get right into our first topic. So for the most part, physician-administered therapies fall under the medical benefit, but with the recent pressure to curb costs in this area, it's not as straightforward anymore. For one, there's the use of colorbagging, which can be covered under both the pharmacy and medical benefit, specifically when you have a payer that chooses to adjudicate all of their specialty pharmacy claims under the pharmacy benefit. Another factor is that payers might try shifting therapies to their pharmacy benefit because they have more levers available to them that they don't have under the medical benefit, like tiering, for example. A tool like tiering can then kind of lead to higher member cost share for drugs that have unfavorable formulary placement, which of course discourages patients from using them. So for example, if there was a drug that was under Part D, as in dog, and it was in the specialty tier, the member cost share could be 33%. And you have to remember that coinsurance under Part D in dog is uncapped. But if the same product were under Part B as in boy, the member would have a 20% coinsurance, which is generally capped at a fixed amount. Plus, the patients usually have a secondary insurance to help cover any out-of-pocket costs. Moving down to the last bullet there, there's also a unique group of drugs that require patients to take different formulations of the same drug, but at different points in the course of their overall therapy. So something like Stelara, for example, requires an IV loading dose followed by subcutaneous injections. So when payers were given that example, most of them confirmed that the IV dose would be covered under medical benefit and the sub-Q under pharmacy benefit because it's a self-injectable. When it comes to pharmacy and medical integration, the P&T committee and the medical policy review team do work closely together, and there is a lot of overlap, with much of the criteria establishment and review being driven by clinicians that sit on both teams. Health plans do in fact develop their own formularies and medical policies regardless of their partnership with PBMs, and they tend to manage step therapy stipulations across both benefits when it's fully integrated. But when it's not, they are limited to stepping within the same benefit. So an example here would be a medical director basically flat out said that they try to keep their steps in the same benefit. If you have rheumatoid arthritis, you'll have to step through Remicade before taking Actemra IV. However, you'd have to step through one of the preferred pharmacy biologics before taking Actemra sub-Q or Cimzia sub-Q instead of Remicade. As I alluded to in the previous slide, it is especially important for those groups of drugs with two different formulations that the management across both benefits be seamless. And unfortunately, there are a few issues that pose a challenge to that. So I'll go over those now. The first is when an employer chooses to use a PBM that is not the one currently partnered with the health plan. This is referred to as a carve-out. Another thing they could do is choose to use the PBM but want a closed formulary. The second challenge is that while health plans are hyper-focused on making clinical-based decisions, sometimes they encounter having to partner with a PBM that's too financially driven, and that can make alignment between the two difficult. The last is when the MCO only offers the pharmacy benefit for a majority of their Medicare members, which goes back to the issue of not being able to have those members step through a drug on the medical side, should it be more cost effective. And then lastly, it's no surprise that the only plans that really have been able to master this are IDNs or integrated delivery networks. Payers and PBMs have an interesting a relationship in that they have different priorities. Generally speaking, they have two different review processes based on those priorities, and they complete them independently. The health plan will define what to cover, including criteria and steps. So for example, United and Kaiser at the moment both have a Part B medical policy that explicitly lists out what their patients with AMD can use. So they've got everyone stepping through Avastin or bevacizumab before trying some of these more expensive treatments like Eylea, Lucentis, Beovu, and Macogen. PBMs will make their recommendation usually based on what's cost efficient for them. But as the costs go up for physician-administered therapies, PBMs are kind of creating this natural path for themselves and kind of taking on certain responsibilities. So a few of those include managing cross-benefit through negotiating medical rebates, coming up with new software that reviews prior authorizations for medical benefit drugs, steering patients to cheaper sites of care, and then reviewing medical claims in detail for as small a thing as dosing inaccuracies. So pretty much they're finding new ways to scrutinize claims and identify waste and unnecessary spend, essentially. So where does this leave manufacturers? Well, the thing is, the first thing to really understand is the different dynamics and incentives that impact decision-making by account. So that includes knowing the split of Medicare Advantage versus Part D patients. And then on the commercial side, knowing the ratio of ASO to fully insured beneficiaries before or when you're planning to approach a health plan. Also knowing if the account is part of a large vertically integrated organization. So for example, a health plan like Cigna would have all those entities covered, so the PBM, the SP, and all of that. It's also important to know that the role of the PBM, not just in the policy decisions, but also in the contracting and claims processing. And then once manufacturers do that, they can use that information to build payer archetypes, begin asking key business questions, like if their therapy is going to be covered under medical or pharmacy benefit, or even if the plan will define a medical policy more restrictively than your indication or the way what was tested in clinical trials. And then in designing the go-to market strategy, be sure to cover, all of the priority access stakeholders, or what we refer to as gatekeepers. So that includes the obvious, the payers and the PBMs, but also going beyond that to make sure you're reaching out to employer benefit design consultants as well. They have a lot of impact. Last but not least, there is now the period of time where where manufacturers can engage in what's called a pre-approval information exchange. For example, commercial teams can collaborate with medical affairs or their HEOR teams to prepare the market for entry of their product, especially in cases where there's product is for a rare disease where there isn't as much information out there. And a good use of this time is just to have discussion with payers to kind of understand what their evidence needs are. So at this time, I'll turn it over to Jason to take us into the next topic of spend and utilization levers across priority therapeutic areas. Jason?
Thanks, Manon. Okay, so for this section, we really want to just explore how we believe payer levers will evolve over the next 3 to 5 years. So when talking to payers, their belief is that many of the tools that they use today will continue to be used in the future, just more frequently. However, when you get into the details, the opportunity for each of these really depends on the therapeutic area and the market conditions. I'd say of this list, when talking to payers, medical rebates and sites of care, those were their two big priorities, and what areas they're most excited about. And most payers we spoke with don't believe that they will have medical formularies that resemble pharmacy formularies. They may have preferred and non-preferred therapies that are managed through steps, but they don't believe that they'll have tiers and exclusions on the medical side. And I think we need to keep this in mind as we discuss these levers going forward. Now I want to go through each of these in more detail. First, I'll play back the research that we heard. Then secondly, talk about what does this really mean to you as you're developing an access strategy. Okay. So let's start with medical rebates. I'd say payers are really excited about medical rebates, and you could hear that in their voice. They would say things like, I just want rebates. We do this on the pharmacy side, why can't we do it in medical? Most agree that they're just getting started today, but in the future, they expect to have more of these agreements. I'd say, however, similar to today, their ability to enter into these contracts will be driven by competitive forces and will focus on therapeutic areas and classes where there's limited perceived differentiation. When they are able to do this, they can incentivize the use of preferred therapies through higher reimbursement to the physician. So for example, if they want to drive preferred use of a biosimilar, they can give a provider an ASP plus 10% reimbursement instead of ASP plus 6% to offset any loss associated with the loss in the margin on the drug itself. When it came to what we heard by TA, say that autoimmune, immunology are the areas of this greatest focus given the competitive dynamics in those areas, in the rheum, derm, and gastro indications, as well as MS. I'd say oncology is another area where they expressed interest. However, the opportunity appears to be limited to those tumor types that are treated with therapies like Avastin, Rituxan, Neupogen that have biosimilar. And this also aligns with the payer step programs that we looked at. Say in general, payers express a limited ability to manage oncology. For oncology, their focus is primarily on clinical pathways and value-based reimbursement models with providers that we'll cover later. When it came to rare disease assets, these likely won't face contracting pressures due to having this limited options for those patients. However, that dynamic changes once you have competition. Once competition increases and payers decide it's time to begin managing these diseases. And for next-gen therapies, and their focus is less on this and more so on the VBCs, and we'll dig into that as well. Okay, next page. Thank you. So what does this mean? I'd say, similar to the pharmacy side, payers want medical rebate contracts. However, the same market conditions have to give the payer contracting leverage. And there are a few things you can do as you think about your strategies. But number one is just having a differentiated value prop with supporting evidence to just minimize these contracting pressures to begin with, which can be easier said than done. I think the PI discussions help inform this. Engaging pre-launch to understand what payers would want to see in a value prop that they would view as truly differentiating, and that would like to avoid a contracting discussion. But if you are one of these highly competitive TAs, then just make sure you have a contracting strategy that's aligned across the pharmacy and medical benefit. Because if you're having a contract on the medical side, then there may be similar pressures from the pharmacy side, especially with those large national accounts that are more actively pursuing white bagging distribution and shifting reimbursement to the pharmacy benefit. Our past experience tells us that payers will not allow you to funnel patients to the benefit that's most profitable for you based on those dual coverages. With dual coverage. Also needs to be understood who you're contracting with. Many of the payers we spoke with suggested that they would manage their own contracting negotiations with manufacturers. However, I can imagine a scenario where Express Scripts and CVS will leverage their size and scale and their investments in medical benefit management to negotiate these agreements on behalf of their customers. Ultimately, a key question here is, for manufacturers, is what am I getting out of a medical rebate contract where tiers and exclusions don't exist? Am I paying for a preferred status to avoid one or more steps? Am I improving my pathway placement? What's in it for us, and what if we decide not to do it? This really comes down to how payers will operationalize these agreements and incentivize the use of preferred therapies, as we previously discussed, and how that will impact prescriber demand. Last thought here is that medical contracting introduces additional ASP and gross to net management requirements from having to optimize your commercial investments across your medical and your pharmacy rebates, as well as provider and GPO discounts that are commonly seen with buy and bill therapies. This just adds additional complexity to your commercial investment decisions and how you optimize your spend. Okay. Now let's shift over to value-based contracting. So the payers we spoke with believe value-based contracting for medical therapies will increase. A few takeaways from our research. One, there are limited VBCs in medical therapies today, but there are some examples, such as in oncology, you have the Avastin and Priority Health Agreement, and in IBD, the recently announced Entyvio and Cimzia deals with Highmark. I'd say the limited uptake of VBCs in medicals is really faces the same challenge you see on the pharmacy side, such as metric alignment, data availability, the infrastructure to manage these contracts, trust between the parties, and various legal and regulatory challenges. Also, payers simply prefer standard rebate contracts. They're easier to manage and the financial impact is more certain for them. From a TA perspective, there is some interest in autoimmune and immunology, and we see that with the Cimzia and Entyvio examples. However, the payers we spoke with really prefer traditional rebate contracts in these disease areas. Rare disease therapies are an area of interest for VBCs due to their cost, smaller populations, which they say helps make it easier to manage the contracts, and the outcomes uncertainty. However, it is similar to traditional rebates. The need for these comes down to competitive pressures and market dynamics. I'd say similar to standard rebate contracts, oncology VBC opportunity focuses on tumor types with the biosimilars and competitive pressures. So again, limited expectations for VBCs in oncology. For next-gen therapies, the payers expect to use VBCs just due to the potential for, one, clearly defined outcome metrics, and also just the uncertainty regarding those long-term outcomes. They're also interested in various alternate payment models for these assets, which gets us to our next page. So for next-gen therapies, in addition to VBCs, we want to touch on alternative financing models as they're a key factor in gaining access to these therapies. I'd say that numerous models are being explored today. Here we introduce a couple options that are being used. One is VBCs and pay over time, and two, risk pools to help employers and plans absorb the upfront cost. Now, for the first option, Zolgensma is an interesting case where they price the therapy based on future cost avoidance, launched with a VBC, and established a 5-year payment model that targeted employers and CMS. I think the 5-year model works better for CMS, given that there's less plan shifting in Medicare than what you see on the commercial side. For the second option, Zolgensma and Luxturna are also part of the Evernorth Embark program, where employer groups and plans contribute a set per member per month to Evernorth to spread the risk across a larger membership base and reduce the impact from a large upfront cost. If you have the critical mass, something like this helps establish a single payer type construct in commercial to help spread the upfront cost and mitigate the risk of patients switching between plans. And these are just 2 examples, but they show what's possible. Overall, this is an area that's still evolving, and work is needed to define a solution that scales and works for all industry players in the absence of a single payer environment. And that allows for payments to be made as value is realized while mitigating the risk of patients switching between plans during that period. So what are the so what's for the VBCs? The VBCs are going to grow, especially with these next-gen therapies as well as competitive areas in oncology and rare diseases. So what can you do? One, say, ensure your pricing aligns with the brand's value drivers, such as any avoidance of future costs or quality-like measures are used in ICER or HTA assessments. 2, ensure your evidence generation plan includes metrics that can be used for VBC. And 3, invest in capabilities to help operationalize these agreements, especially if widespread VBC adoption will be required to ensure broad access. And for next-gen therapies, prepare to operate under multiple payment model structures until the industry establishes a norm. All right, moving on to color bagging. Most payers believe the use of color bagging will increase, but there are some considerations. The first is buy and bill dead. We hear that a lot, we read about that a lot, we see the trends, but it really comes down to provider business models and the desire of payers to keep certain providers in their network. So for example, infusions represent a significant revenue stream for community oncology practices and some gastro supergroups. They will push back on payer attempts to mandate color bagging, and therefore payers allow buy and bill, just given the importance of keeping these providers in their network. Another factor is the payer business model. National vertically integrated payers have a desire to control the patient and incentive to color bag as they own the specialty pharmacies that stand to benefit from the additional fees and dispensing revenue that comes from white or brown bagging. Also, it's interesting. We hear that color bagging and shifting from medical to pharmacy is done to reduce cost. However, during our discussions, we clearly heard a couple of things. One, that white bagging doesn't always reduce cost. There are cases where the ASP has eroded enough where ASP plus reimbursement may be less than a WP-based reimbursement to the pharmacy. And also, white bagging does not require a shift in the pharmacy benefit. Specialty pharmacies are able to submit medical claims, and really it just comes down to who can get the best price. Is it the provider or the specialty pharmacy? And based on that, the claim will be adjudicated accordingly. So color bagging is most applicable to TAs where 1, infusion is not a significant revenue driver for the practice, and 2, providers prefer not to buy and bill because of the upfront cost or storage requirements. And 3, the payer is able to drive color bagging and maintain their provider networks. And now one of the so what's for color bagging. The use of color bagging is going to increase, and predominantly in competitive TAs where, again, infusion doesn't really influence RX behavior. Providers prefer not to buy and bill, and payers have the ability to mandate color bagging. Also, where payers are vertically integrated, like a Cigna, CVS, United. I'd say that brand teams should really just assess the future of buy and bill in that disease area and define your payer and provider pricing and contracting strategies accordingly. For example, how much should you really invest in GPO contracting if the majority of the market will eventually flow through a specialty pharmacy channel? Also, channel distribution strategies will need to work in a bifurcated model. For example, to support national payers that do force color bagging and reimburse under the pharmacy benefit versus a regional blue that allows for, maybe encourages, but doesn't mandate white bagging and reimburses under the medical benefits. Patient services will be needed to support the buy and bill and the color bagging models. So for example, dual BV/PA navigation and the logistics to ensure that all the pieces come together in a white bagging scenario. Lastly, another consideration is the impact that color bagging has on access and utilization in health systems or community practices that have their own pharmacies for in-office dispensing, which is a similar dynamic that we see today in open versus limited distribution model decisions for pharmacy. Okay. So moving on to site of care. Site of care is a large priority for payers and can be summarized simply as getting treatment out of the hospitals and into lower cost options, including physician offices, standalone infusion centers, and the home. Site of care is primarily a challenge where physicians are affiliated with health systems and utilize the hospital's outpatient infusion centers, or when local community practices that don't have infusion capabilities refer their patients to the local hospital for treatment. Another consideration is home infusion. I think we've seen that COVID has increased the use of home infusion. However, the use cases for this are specific, and there are challenges to be managed, such as provider concern over the handling of therapies that are shipped to the patient's home. I think the overall future of home infusion and specific TAs is a topic that's just worth a deeper dive on its own. Okay. So for the implications on site of care, payer and providers can be aligned or find themselves at odds when it comes to site of care. And manufacturers need to be sensitive to that dynamic and develop strategies that align with those dynamics. So how do you do that? One example is community practices that have invested in infusion centers will continue to treat patients there. However, those that have not will need to refer out. So in those cases, manufacturers can invest in programs that help manage referrals to lower cost sites, such as those provided by a standalone infusion center rather than the local hospital outpatient infusion center. And on that note, in general, it's maybe worthwhile to invest in standalone infusion center relationships, particularly in rheum, gastro, derm, MS, neurology. Organizations like Metro Infusion, IVX, and Paragon provide freestanding infusion centers that accept referrals, while organizations like Helix and Paragon will help provider practices stand up and operate their own on-site infusion suites. And these companies provide pharmacy, BVPA support, and additional patient services. So it's important to understand the degree to which these organizations are being used and develop strategies to engage them to ensure that, one, your therapy is available in their centers, which impacts your distribution and contracting strategy. Two, appropriate services are available to the patient, impacting your hub and patient services strategy. And then three, that you and the manufacturer has access to their utilization data that comes from those institutions. Another opportunity is to develop services that help facilitate home infusion where it represents an opportunity or makes sense. And I think combining the standalone infusion centers and home infusion both require services and protocols to ensure that patients have access to therapy in those preferred sites of care. And then lastly, for therapies where hospital utilization will still be important, you need to ensure that your value proposition meets the newness and incremental value thresholds to get the NTAP that will protect providers who are reimbursed under DRG payments and may be underwater on some of these therapies. Overall, this is a significant barrier to branded therapy utilization within the hospital setting. Okay. Shifting gears to oncology pathways. So oncology pathways represent an area of high interest for payers. This is one of their primary levers to manage oncology because for the most part, they don't restrict access in this area outside of biosimilars. During our discussions, we've heard quotes like, "I don't want to be in the Wall Street Journal as a payer that denied a cancer patient their medicine." I think we heard variations of that comment a few times. The largest payers have implemented pathways. However, prior research shows that they typically don't restrict access beyond NCCN guidelines. The exception appears to be in early lines of therapy where they may select a lower NCCN preferred regimen and reserve the higher cost regimens for later lines. For example, looking at Darzalex, which was approved in September 2019 for first-line multiple myeloma utilization for transplant-eligible and ineligible populations. Looking at payer pathways, Cigna and United do not include Darzalex in that first-line option. So what's the so what in that? In this case, if providers adhere to the pathway, not only would this asset not achieve its first-line potential, it would be relegated to later lines where they would face additional competitive pressures from within their class that don't exist in the first-line indication. Payers don't mandate pathway adherence, however, they do try to incentivize it through various financial incentives and expedited PAs. So what does this mean for oncology manufacturers? Really, there's a need to understand the impact of suboptimal placement on payer pathways to prescribing behavior in different types of oncology practices. Because this will have it'll impact your academics differently than your community practices that are heavily reimbursed under OCM versus those community practices reimbursed primarily under fee-for-service models. And based on that, develop strategies to improve placement as possible and appropriate. So, for example, pulling through NCCN guidelines. Also, is this worth a contracting discussion in oncology? Would that help move the needle to result in a better pathway placement, and is that worth it from a manufacturer standpoint? Okay. So we've covered a number of topics, including what we heard from the research and what we think it means. Here we try to summarize the main takeaways by therapeutic area. So for autoimmune immunology agents, we expect to face most of the payer levels we've been discussing, given the overall span in these diseases, emergence of biosimilars, competition within and across classes, and just the overall high payer desire to manage these conditions. For oncology, expect to face potentially restrictive clinical pathways and value-based care provider reimbursement models that may impact prescriber treatment choice, especially for those practices heavily reimbursed under OCM. Ensure that NCCN endorsements critical to avoiding steps for newly launched assets or indications. And excluding biosimilars, contracting, colorbagging, and site of care management will be less challenging in oncology than we see in other TAs. For rare diseases, payers have a limited ability to manage these assets due to having a lack of options for the patients. However, the emergence of new entrants and second-in-class therapies could shift those therapies to more closely resemble competitive markets. VBCs will be more relevant in this space given the high cost, small patient populations, and outcomes uncertainty. Lastly, for next-gen or curative therapies, they will face value-based contracting and alternative payment models that deal with the high upfront cost of treatment and the durability uncertainty. All these areas require market access strategies that allow for the identification and breaking down of patient access barriers across the patient journey. The strategies and barriers may be different by TA, however, a consistent approach can be utilized as you think about your access strategies. So we create a market access framework that's based on 5 value pillars that we use to help our clients define their strategies. Quickly go through these 5. The first is value definition. So we're thinking through and getting elaborate on how do you define the value of your therapy in your offering that aligns with how your access decision makers perceive value and what they value. 2 is articulation. So how do you articulate the value through your claims and your messaging that's supported by evidence? How do you then capture that value through pricing and contracting strategies? Deliver that value through your channel distribution strategies and your patient services, and then allow for that tailored engagement so that when you are engaging your various payer and access stakeholders, your messaging, your solutions really aligns with what they value and you have that alignment. But all of these need to align with the overall brand plan, success factors, and strategic imperatives. The framework is really just intended to help brand teams gain alignment around the key market access decisions. Each of these pillars is broken down into multiple components containing key business questions to guide access strategy, development, and alignment. A lot of the items in this framework represent things you do today, but this provides a structured approach to work through key questions to make decisions. If anyone's interested in drilling into this deeper, please feel free to reach out to me after today's session. I'd say in general, one, just thank you. So please feel free to reach out to any of us if you have any questions or like to learn more or go deeper into some of the topics we discussed today. I know we covered a lot. So thanks for listening, and we'd now like to open up for a few questions. Okay.
All right, so I'm looking through here, got a few questions. All right, the first one says, looking into your crystal ball, do you think buy and bill will still be a thing 5 years from now? Jason, do you want to take this one?
Yeah, I can take that. Yeah, that is a good question, and I think that's probably one of the more overarching questions, actually. Yeah, when doing this research, doing this work over the last year, you read about buy and bill dying. You see the trends of everything shifting to Colorbagging. But I think about the work done like in oncology and immunology. I don't see it going away. Especially when you have like these community oncology practices where they are. Infusion is really a core part of their business model. I recall talking to an oncologist a while back, and we were looking at cost profiles for different regimens. And it's interesting how this individual just knew the cost and the profitability of various regimens down to the penny. For which he knew that the time in the chair, the ASP spread on the product, where they were their GPO contracts. Given that dynamic, and then in a gastro, I've talked to gastros that have said that, again, it's a large super group where the patient's having to buy and having a color bag, that they would just refer that patient out. So I think there are markets like oncology, like gastro, some of these conditions where infusion is such a core part of the business model that I don't see it going away. I think a lot of the market will shift to more color bagging, but like in those cases, I think it'll be a lot of pushback. And really the only way to change that is if you, I guess, have like policy proposals or change the reimbursement dynamic so you eliminate that incentive for net cost recovery and collecting that spread.
So another one reads, as you did your research, what were some of the most interesting findings for you? I can take that one. I would say probably the potential to manage cross-benefit. I knew it was coming. I didn't think it'd start so soon. Like with United and Kaiser, as I had mentioned before, I've seen a couple others where they're managing steps even within the medical benefit side. And so to see them actually cross benefit and have a wider array of cheaper products to have their patients step through so soon, I thought that was interesting. I'd say probably another one is just that this whole myth around color bagging being cheaper, that got busted pretty quick. A lot of payers spoke to how it really just depends on what the plan's incentives and motivations are, but behind that step. But it's not always cheaper. And then I thought an interesting one too is that there'll be actually it's already kind of started different fee schedules that incentivize cheaper use of or using cheaper products. So there were a couple of interesting things to come out of the research. We'll answer one last question in the interest of time. I see we're coming up at the minute. This last question says, can you provide an example for how you can use your framework to navigate a specific access challenge? So I'll go ahead and I'll give this one back to Jason.
Okay. So another question is how to use a framework to what? Sorry, I didn't catch that part.
Yeah, no problem. Can you provide an example for how you can use your framework to navigate a specific access challenge?
Okay. Yeah, so I'd say, in general, our framework and most frameworks are really just meant to structure your thinking and give you an approach to really work through choices. And so, giving an example for this, it's a pretty common example where you may have a brand team that they want to identify the gaps in their evidence generation plan and align the priorities to address. And so, using our framework, we help teams step through that. So one is aligning on what are our access objectives for this brand? What are we trying to accomplish? Is it to get first-line utilization to avoid a step? And if that's the case, thinking about what are the payer and other access decision maker drivers and barriers to achieving that objective. So why would they do that, or why wouldn't they? And then to achieve our objective, like what kind of messaging or claims would they want to see to help move the needle? And then bringing that together, it's working through that approach, and you work with the brand team to say, this is what we heard. Now let's align cross-functionally on these are the claims that we think will move the needle. This is where we have evidence. Don't. Here are the gaps. And this is our plan to really address to move forward. And because we step through this, and we're all aligned, we're on the same page regarding the priorities and what we think needs to happen to really achieve that objective. Hopefully, the answer is you can achieve that objective through differentiation of messaging and not contracting. That's the goal here, right? But that is like how you use a framework to really just organize and structure how do you make choices, make decisions, and really step through various aspects of your access strategy to ensure that alignment throughout. Okay. I realize we are at about 3 or 4 minutes over our time here. So I just want to say, one, thank you for joining us. And I think we really enjoyed really doing the research in this space, putting this together. And a lot of our work is on the pharmacy side, and on the medical side, you really go deeper into some of these buy and bill dynamics and things are just nuanced you don't really see on the pharmacy side. So we really enjoyed doing this work and thinking through this side of things. And you see our contact information below. So if you have any questions, want to go deeper into anything, I know we've covered a lot of topics. We covered a lot in a short period of time. So if you want to go deeper in certain areas, please feel free to reach out to any of us. Happy to chat more. And again, thank you, and have a great day.
Wow, I just really want to thank Jason, James, and Fanon for today's really detailed presentation, and thank you everyone for joining us. We do have a bunch of questions that we will be responding to via email, so be on the lookout for that. And also you'll receive an email with a direct link to today's recorded presentation once it is available. Please do reach out to us, as Jason has said. That now concludes today's webinar. Hey, have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.